expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. In 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which has been described as the most comprehensive reform of our nation's financial system since the Great Depression. Although intended largely to address the large financial institutions which contributed to the financial crisis of 2008, Dodd-Frank has also allegedly burdened smaller banks with significant costs. How much have banks, and particularly small banks, been affected by the law and its subsequent regulations? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about his research on this question is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Thomas Hogan. In addition to his research on banking as a professor, Thomas recently served almost 2 years as a staff economist for the U.S. Senate Banking Committee. And so he's seen financial regulation close up as well as through the lens of research. Welcome back to the show, Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in Troy and a pleasure to be back on the show.
So in 2008, we suffered through the Great Recession, and one of the things that distinguished the Great Recession from other downturns that we've had since the end of World War II was a significant financial crisis. And as some people have described it as the greatest financial crisis we've had certainly since the Great Depression. Do you think that's a fair characterization of what was contributing to our recession?
Yeah, I think some of the comparisons when we talk about the biggest recession since the Great Depression, a lot of that is in terms of the magnitude of the economic fluctuations, and that's true. But like you said, one of the main connections is that there was a financial crisis, which doesn't happen very often, and clearly doesn't happen in the magnitude that it did in the recent crisis or in the Great Depression. And so there are a lot of similarities. In the Great Depression, a lot of the failures were regular commercial banks that make loans to small businesses, that make mortgage loans so that people can help buy a house. And in the recent financial crisis, a lot of it was tied to the larger financial institutions, and in some cases, mostly non-bank financial institutions, what some people would call the shadow banking sector. And so that distinction, in some ways, is similar because it is both a problem of the banking system, but also a little bit different in the way that the government reacted towards the crisis. I think in the Great Depression, although this is not the normal way a lot of people speak about it, and it's not what we teach in high school textbooks, but most economists would agree that during the Great Depression, the depth of the Depression was partly caused by the government not bailing out banks. The Federal Reserve that regulates the U.S. money supply and regulates the U.S. banking system has a responsibility to determine if a bank is troubled and needs assistance, and is supposed to make targeted loans as the lender of last resort to help troubled financial institutions and troubled banks that could still survive. In the Great Depression, they didn't do that. And a large number of the bank failures were banks that probably could have been saved if the Fed had acted appropriately, but they didn't. And so economists generally agree that the Great Depression was largely caused by a failure of the Federal Reserve, and most people really aren't aware of that, so that's kind of important. In the recent crisis, it was kind of the opposite, that the Fed bailed out everybody.
Right, yeah. So that is sort of like, that's a nice segue to point out. In 2008, we ended up intervening and bailing out a lot of the banks that were in crisis, right? Yeah,
and I think that's the way that a lot of people think about it is, especially Ben Bernanke, that was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, was an economic expert on the Great Depression and understood that there was a problem that the Fed should have helped as a lender of last resort. And so he was kind of going the other way, where he wanted to make sure that we didn't make that same mistake. Right. And so a lot of people would say, well, the Fed really helped the economy by helping save all these institutions, but other economists would say, the Fed really went too far. They're in charge of the banking system, but they bailed out all these non-banks, they bailed out investment banks, they bailed out AIG, and the insurance that AIG did. In fact, they bailed out AIG 3 times and ended up owning almost 80%, 79.9%, because they couldn't legally go to 80% for technical reasons. And so, a lot of that stuff just is really kind of beyond what the Fed is expected to do. And they were trying to be safe by, doing a little bit more, but I think that could have had negative consequences for the economy.
One of the consequences or things that followed having bailed out so many banks and non-banks was a desire to prevent this from happening again. And to prevent this from happening again, as there's a debate in Washington as to the extent to which deregulation of the financial industry had led to the problems that led to the financial crisis. But Congress decided to act, and in 2010 we had the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act, and so that was Congress's response, sort of, to try to, yes, we bailed out the banks, but we don't want to have this happen again, and so we wanted to change the rules to try to prevent a recurrence of this financial crisis, right?
Yeah, in the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010 was, as you mentioned earlier, the biggest reform ever of the banking and financial system, and was intended to prevent a financial crisis by preventing a lot of the bigger banks from taking too much risk, and ensuring that if they did take too much risk, that there would be a way to wind them down and dissolve the bank without having a big impact on the economy, and done in a way where the Fed wouldn't have to bail them out again. And so it was kind of a combination of things that were targeted at big banks, but at the same time, a lot of other things that really kind of had nothing to do with protecting us against big bank failures, that were just a lot of other financial regulations that in some cases had really nothing at all to do with the financial crisis. And so it was this major reform package predicated on the idea that we're going to prevent a financial crisis by shoring up and regulating the big risky banks, but it also had impacts on all kinds of other banks that really had nothing to do with the crisis.
So the desire to change the regulations or add regulations to the financial system came out of a debate which amongst economists. I think economists wouldn't agree on whether deregulation of the financial industry actually led to the 2008 crisis or not.
Right.
So what were the two different sides of this debate about deregulation?
So before we get to the impact of the Dodd-Frank Act, we should probably talk, like you said, about prior to the financial crisis, what was going on in the financial system in terms of regulation and deregulation. And so one of the things that people say on the news all the time, and you hear it talked about and written, was that deregulation caused the financial crisis. And even though people say that, I'm not always sure what they mean by that, because there really wasn't any major deregulation in the 90s or 2000s. There was a little bit of derivatives deregulation under the Clinton administration, and then there was the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999. But there really wasn't ever a time, despite those things, that the number of regulations went down. And so year after year, we have more and more financial regulations. And so it's strange to talk about that as deregulation when there's a new law that repeals 2 regulations but introduces 10 more. That's really more regulation and not deregulation. And so you can see we've got a chart here of regulations over time since 1970 through 2014, and you can see that there's pretty steady growth throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s until the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, and after that the number of regulations shoots up. So let me explain actually just a little bit about what this chart shows and where it comes from. So this is a measure of the restrictions on U.S. commercial banks, and it's a data set that is put together by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And the problem here is it's really hard to measure these things. So when we talk about the number of regulations, what do we really mean? When there's a bill It's got some things that might restrict the banking system. When we look at laws, how do we count those things? There's no real measure. And so traditionally, people have used proxies like the number of pages in the Code of Financial Regulations, or the budgets of these agencies, or something like that. And the Mercatus Center has written a program that reads through the Code of Federal Regulations and looks for restrictions. It looks for things like when the law says you must do this or you must not do that, or a bank shall do this or shall not do that, right? And all these restrictions, and then they count them up and say, okay, that's the number of rules that the bank has to follow. And so that's what we see here in this graph, is that there was slow growth in the number of restrictions all through the 90s. There's a slight dip in 1996 and 1997, but that's not a time of deregulation. That's a time of consolidation where they realized, oh, we've written the same thing in two places. Let's mark it out and write it in one place. And so the measured number of restrictions goes down, but there's really no deregulation there because it's the same amount of laws that the banks are subject to. And so there's no period during the 1990s or 2000s where we see deregulation. So when people talk about deregulation before the financial crisis, I'm not sure what they mean by that exactly. There was never a period of deregulation. The more nuanced argument is, some people will say, well, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999 allowed one specific thing that we should consider to be a big deregulation, and that was it allowed commercial and investment banks to merge into one. There had previously been a prohibition on commercial and investment banking that came from the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, so enacted during the Great Depression as a response to the bank failures of that time. And Gramm-Leach-Bliley repealed that prohibition, and so allowed commercial and investment banks to merge.
If you could, for us, could you explain like the difference between these commercial and investment banks? Because I know investment banks were some of the ones that got into a lot of trouble in 2008, and people might not be sure if you're clear on exactly what that difference is.
Yeah, that's right. So commercial banks are regular banks that you would go to, that individuals deposit their savings and have a checking account or a savings account, and they manage your regular transactions. And so for businesses and individuals, you deal with a commercial bank, and most of their business is making mortgage loans to people that want to buy a home, or making loans to small businesses that want to hire more workers or build a new factory or something like that. Investment banks are a little bit more like asset management funds that big companies and very rich individuals put their money in the investment bank, and the investment bank goes out and makes strategic investments trying to make a profit. And so they're looking at much bigger investments and a lot more risk. And so they're, in some sense, a lot different than commercial banks. But we do have large firms, a lot of the big companies like Bank of America and Citigroup and the major US banks have both investment banks and commercial banks put together in one single bank.
Okay, so and so it would be the investment banks that were taking on these more risky actions, investments, for instance, in like real estate or subprime mortgages, and that contributed to the financial crisis.
Right. Yeah, and so if you just think about those definitions and what they do, then it kind of makes sense, that idea that, well, we should have these things separate. Commercial banks and investment banks should be separate, so that we don't have the risky investments being made by the commercial banks or the universal banks. And that sounds like it might be right, but it turns out if we look at where all the risk was in the crisis, like you said, a lot of it was investment banks, but a lot of those banks were in some sense saved or bailed out by the commercial banks. And so when Merrill Lynch was failing, they got bought up by Bank of America, which essentially saved that bank and allowed them to keep functioning during the financial crisis. Same thing with Bear Stearns. They weren't bailed out by the Fed. Instead, they were purchased by JP Morgan Chase and were allowed to continue functioning. And so there was no major disruption in the financial system because we were allowing commercial and investment banks to merge. If we weren't able to do that, the financial crisis clearly would have been much worse. And in fact, the regulators, the Federal Reserve, who, I mean, they've been a proponent of all the huge increase in regulation since the crisis, but they say, we shouldn't go far enough to separate commercial and investment banking. It would create more risk. And so the people that are saying that caused the financial crisis. I think there's really no evidence of that. The evidence says if we had separated those things, the crisis would have been a lot worse.
But what we can see on this graph is that since Dodd-Frank was passed, the regulatory burden on banks has exploded, right?
Yeah. In fact, I mean, it's almost doubled. So after the Dodd-Frank Act passed, so the Dodd-Frank Act was the biggest piece of financial regulation ever, potentially the biggest law ever written. And so I have a copy of it here. It is this 2,000-page book that I have, more than 360,000 words. So this giant thing was one bill that passed through the U.S. Congress, and it directed the financial regulators to write all the specific regulations. Right. And so the actual number of regulations comes out to be much larger than the Dodd-Frank Act itself. I also have a copy of the Code of Federal Regulations Title 12 on banks and banking. So that is this. So this is, if you're a U.S. bank, you know, even a small bank with 10 employees, you have to abide by all of these laws. You know, huge number of laws, thousands of pages, and the font in this is pretty small. So imagine if you're a small business and you only have a couple of employees and you have to obey every single one of these laws. And you gotta go through this book and make sure you're in compliance with every one. And this is just the laws that are specific to banks. So they're also subject to all kinds of other commercial laws, just being a regular business. And by comparison, this is my copy, my pocket constitution, that is 50 pages. And so the entire US Constitution fits in these 50 pages compared to 2,000 plus pages for the Dodd-Frank Act, and I don't even know how many thousands of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations on banks and banking.
Well, and this gets into where the burden on banks might be coming into, and that is in terms of trying to comply with all of these regulations. And I've seen some estimates that for the larger banks, 10% or more of their employees are involved in, quote, compliance. What exactly do we mean by compliance? Because it's now almost like a cottage industry in the United States, especially in finance.
Yeah, so compliance with all these regulations is really difficult, and it's hard in some ways for big banks and hard in other ways for small banks. For small banks, a lot of the issue is legal and accounting, and so in an accounting sense, you have to have a lot more careful procedures about going through every one of your books and making sure that things are added up correctly. And legally, you have to have someone come in and make sure that you're in compliance with all of these laws. I mean, that giant book of laws, if you're the manager of a bank that only has 10 employees, you have to spend a lot of time making sure that you're in compliance with all that. And the forms that the bankers have to fill out are very detailed. Starting in the early 90s, the reporting requirements for banks have become more and more complex, where the regulators want to know about every single type of asset that you hold and how risky that is, and then they put it through this calculation where they describe, okay, how risky is your bank based on all these different assets that you have, and how risky is this one, and how risky is this one, and how risky is that one. And the bankers themselves are responsible for going through all those forms, filling out information about every single asset type that they have to hold. And the truth is, that stuff doesn't matter for small banks. For small banks, I mean, they're mostly just making regular mortgage loans. All those other things have nothing to do with them, and yet they have to go through all these reporting requirements in order to make sure that they're not accidentally marking one asset in one category and it's actually in another category, and then they get penalized, and it's really difficult for them. The managers have to spend a lot of time on it. They have to hire lawyers, they have to hire auditors to make sure all that stuff is in compliance and in line with the regulations. The big banks have a little bit different problem, that they are subject to additional requirements in terms of the mix of assets that they have. And so in addition to all the reporting forms, which, for a big bank, you've got dozens of people working on that anyway. It's no problem for you to fill out a couple of additional forms. That doesn't matter at all. What matters is that for the bigger banks, the regulators are going to come in and look at not just the way that you've accounted for your assets in the reporting, but the actual risk sensitivity. So if there's some kind of financial event, what's going to happen to your entire portfolio? Rather than just looking at the assets individually, they're going to look at the whole bank and say, if we have some kind of economic shock, what's going to happen? And so there are a couple of different ways that they do that. One is called stress testing, where they say there's some stress in the economy, what's going to happen to your bank? And then there are a couple ones where they specifically look at your investment portfolio, and they look at over time, how has it fluctuated and how big is the volatility. And so the bigger banks, they don't care as much about the legal and auditing stuff because they got tons of people doing that anyway. They have teams of people coming in to go through all their stress testing and see, how much value do we have at risk, what's going to happen if we have a financial crisis, and making sure that they're going to meet all the regulatory requirements and that the regulators aren't going to come in and say, hey, you're too risky, because then they get penalized. There are things where they're not allowed to pay dividends, where they're could potentially even be closed by the regulators. And so so they worry a lot more about the portfolio and risk analysis part. The small banks worry a lot more about the reporting requirements that really shouldn't even apply to them in a lot of cases.
And any of these employees that get assigned or you have to hire people or move employees to deal with compliance issues, those compliance employees are not doing things like customer service or helping filling out loan applications.
They should be out there helping make loans, helping people get a mortgage so they can buy a house, helping a business that wants to expand. And so that's a great point. That's been one of the big questions since the financial crisis. We've seen really small lending growth. I mean, normally after a big recession or a big crisis, where things are bad for a little while and then we bounce back immediately, especially after a financial crisis, because it's not like real assets are destroyed, it's just financial wealth that is lost. And so it's easy to put that back together. But that hasn't happened this time. And so one of the real questions is, how much has regulation interfered with that? Is it because no one wants to take out a loan, or is it because banks just can't lend to people because they have all their employees working on compliance instead of working on making loans and doing the regular business of banking? So
let's get into the research contribution that you've made here, and that deals with trying to actually measure the impact that Dodd-Frank and the compliance related to that might have had on banks generally and small banks. So tell us a little bit, like, how would you or how other researchers have gone about trying to address this question?
Right. So when I was at the Senate Banking Committee, we had lots and lots of banks come in. I mean, a lot of small and community banks that would make the trip up to DC, and they would come in groups and tell us, look, we're being crushed by these regulations. I mean, we're having to fill out all these forms that just have nothing to do with us, and it's a bunch of needless compliance, and there are a bunch of new mortgage laws that prevent us from making loans that everybody wants to do, but we can't do them for some legal reason. And they had lots of personal stories about how it was affecting their businesses. But the regulators just don't seem to think that it's much of a problem. When we talk to the regulators, they kind of say, yeah, the banks are saying that, but we just don't see it in the numbers. And so
what numbers
it's hard
were
to
they
tell.
looking at?
So they're looking at banks' expenses, that banks fill out reports every single quarter, and they said, bank expenses just haven't gone up. And so they kind of felt like the banks are just complaining. They just don't like the new regulations, and so they don't want to deal with it. And so it's not really a problem because we don't see it in the numbers. And I thought, I don't know. It seems like we've got so many banks complaining and saying, like, telling us about how hard it is for them to deal with these new regulations. It seems like it must have an impact. I mean, we saw on the chart where the number of banking regulations doubled, and surely that has some impact on how the banks are behaving and the expenses that they have to pay in terms of complying with those regulations. And so a co-author and I, Scott Burns, put together a paper where we looked at bank expenses to see whether or not they had actually gone up after the Dodd-Frank Act. And so you can see we have a couple of graphs here. On the left is large banks with total assets of $10 billion or more, and on the right is smaller banks with assets of less than $10 billion. And what these two charts show is non-interest expenses as a percentage of bank assets. Okay, so let me explain that just for a second. So bank expenses have two major forms. One of them is interest expenses that because they're a bank, they have depositors and they have people that have deposited money in the bank and they pay them a little bit.
Okay.
Right now it's not very much, 0.25% or less, very small, but when the economy is doing well, they pay a couple of percent or something. And so they have to pay money to their depositors. And that's based on the state of the economy and some other factors. But that's one source of expenses that they pay people for their deposits. The other source of expenses is regular business activities, what we would call non-interest expenses. And so that's things like paying the salaries of your employees, paying for the rent of the buildings that you own, regular business activities basically. And so that's what we want to look at to see, okay, so if the banks are saying they're paying a bunch of new employees for compliance activities, that should show up in non-interest expenses. And so what we've done here is we've taken the non-interest expenses and divided them by the bank's total assets, because you would think a bank that's twice as big, they're going to have twice as much in expenses. And so if we divide by the size of the bank, that tells us, okay, as a percentage of bank assets, how much are they paying in non-interest expenses, right? How much is their expenses adjusted for bank size? And so that's what we see in these graphs is, again, on the left, it's large banks. And starting in 1995, we see some kind of jagged lines here. There's seasonal variation, so it makes it a little bit funny looking. But we have the black line that is the average in each quarter. Because that's when banks fill out their reports every quarter. And then the dotted lines represent prior to the financial crisis. So that's from 1995 up to 2007. We see that for the large banks, they're pretty stable. Expenses were declining before the financial crisis already a little bit. The bigger banks may have already started firing employees and cutting back expenses if they saw a recession coming. And then in 2008 to 2010, their expenses drop a lot because that's at the stage where they were laying people off and not investing in new activities. And then after 2010, we do see that their expenses shoot up. But really, for the big banks, they're not much higher than before the crisis. I mean, they're high for a couple of years when they've brought in a bunch of new lawyers and auditing people and stuff like that. But then they go down a little bit to about the pre-crisis level. However, if you look at the graph on the right, this is for small banks, and we see that prior to the financial crisis, their expenses were declining as a percentage of assets, and they stayed pretty low through 2010, but then they shoot up after 2010, more like 2013 or 2014, when all those new regulations are coming into place. So it's not when the Dodd-Frank Act is passed, it's a year or two later once the regulators have actually created the regulations, and then banks have to comply.
And then you can break this down a little bit further, right?
Yeah, and so in some sense, the regulators were, I mean, you could say, well, it's not that big of a difference there, but it's even bigger if we just look at salaries. And so if we look at if we ignore the other things like the expenses of paying your rent and electricity and whatever, and just look at what we're paying to employees, are they hiring more employees after the Dodd-Frank Act? And so again, this is this is salaries as a percentage of bank assets. And so on the left, we have large banks, and you can see that they take a big dip during the financial crisis, and then they do shoot up again after the Dodd-Frank Act, but they stabilize at a level that's really lower than prior to the financial crisis. Whereas for small banks, they're pretty stable before the crisis, then they dip a little bit, and then they shoot up to a level that is higher than before the financial crisis. And so what we see here basically is that if we break it down and look at employee expenses, the big banks, they did increase their expenses after Dodd-Frank, but it's really not as high as it was before, so it's hard to tell, what's really going on there. But for small banks, it's clearly the case that they're paying higher salaries, they're paying more to their employees. And if you look at the number of employees, it's basically the same as this. So it's not like they changed the salary levels, but they're hiring and paying more people than before the crisis. So it seems like they do have a lot of people working in compliance that they just didn't need before.
Well, this has been very interesting, and I think if anything, it's ironic because the small banks are paying a compliance price for a crisis that they didn't really create.
Right.
Well, thanks for coming on and talk about this here today, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.